Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
Your brother's doing so well, Mom said loudly across the table, pausing her fork midair like she expected a round of applause for the observation, her voice slicing through the low clinking of cutlery and fake laughter like a serrated knife through dry cake. Maybe one day you'll get there too. I felt the words slide under my skin with the same dull sharpness I'd grown used to over the years, soft enough to pretend they were harmless, sharp enough to leave a mark. So I nodded calmly, like I'd rehearsed it. I have, I said, folding my napkin like I had all the time in the world. I just didn't see the point in telling anyone who didn't believe in me. And with that, the entire room collapsed into silence, not the kind of silence where people are lost in thought, but the kind where the air thickens with discomfort, where your own heartbeat becomes a metronome for everything unsaid. And every face freezes in the way people do when the mirror turns around unexpectedly. I hadn't been home in almost 2 years, and honestly, I never intended to come back, not even for Mom's birthday dinner. But guilt, specifically the kind that smells like mashed potatoes and overcooked roast, can get its claws in deep. Especially when wielded with precision by a mother who knows exactly which memories to twist. So there I was, sitting in the same dining room where for the better part of 3 decades I'd been cast as the quirky one, the drifter, the girl with so much potential if only she'd apply herself. Nodding along as everyone fawned over my brother Luke's newest achievement, a modest promotion at a logistics firm he'd only gotten because our uncle pulled some strings. Luke, of course, basked in it like he always did, his head tilted just slightly, a humble brag smile playing on his lips, his hands gesturing like some TED Talk knockoff as he recounted the challenges of managing a small but rapidly growing team, which, from what I knew, consisted of 2 interns and a temp who only worked Tuesdays. My father grunted approvingly, like Luke had just cured cancer or fixed the country's debt, while Mom beamed with that particular kind of pride reserved for golden boys who could do no wrong, even when doing very little. I smiled, too, not because I found it charming, but because I'd mastered the art of emotional taxidermy. Smile wide, blink slowly, and bury the twitching parts deep. I didn't say a word for the first 40 minutes of dinner. I just watched. Watched how the conversation looped in predictable patterns, how every topic found a way back to Luke, his new house, his fiancé's Pilates studio, his dog's raw food diet, even his brief foray into cryptocurrency, which Mom referred to as his digital finance project, like he was some Silicon Valley wunderkind. No one asked what I'd been doing, which didn't surprise me. They didn't know what questions to ask, because the version of me that lived in their heads had stopped evolving sometime around my 24th birthday, when I quit my corporate job and started something I never talked about. To them, I'd been floating ever since. Then came the comment, Mom's well-aimed jab, launched under the disguise of small talk, but sharpened by years of quiet disapproval. And I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the way Luke laughed just a little too loud at something Dad said about kids these days wanting instant success. Or maybe it was just time. I'd held it in for so long that the truth didn't spill, it sliced. I said. I just didn't see the point in telling anyone who didn't believe in me. It didn't land like a bomb. Bombs are loud. This was quieter, colder, like when you realize the water's risen past your chin. Forks hovered midair. Napkins froze halfway to mouths. Luke blinked like I'd spoken in another language. Mom furrowed her brow, the way she always did when I said something that didn't fit the character she'd written for me. Dad made a sound, not quite a word, more like the start of a cough or the ghost of a rebuttal. Luke tried to laugh it off, said something like, okay, big shot, in that playful mean way siblings do when they feel control slipping, but his eyes darted toward me, uncertain, almost scared. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just kept sipping my wine, slowly, like this was the most ordinary conversation in the world. And that's when it happened, the shift. You can always feel it, the moment people start looking at you not as you were, but as someone they might not know at all. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's just quiet. But in that quiet, you can almost hear the rewiring happening. Like gears grinding after years of rust. Like maybe, just maybe, the stories they've told themselves don't hold water anymore. That maybe you were never what they thought, and worse, that you might be something more. Luke leaned forward, his smile tight now, eyes narrowing just a bit. You mean you actually did something with your life? I smiled. A real one this time. More than you'll ever know. And, just like that, the mood changed. Not because of what I said, but because of what they couldn't say in return. Because suddenly, I wasn't playing along anymore. I wasn't nodding or excusing or shrinking. I had said one thing, and it had changed everything. And I hadn't even gotten started. It's funny how easily a person can disappear right in front of the people who are supposed to know them best, how you can sit at the same dinner table year after year, smile through the same conversations, answer the same tired questions, and slowly become nothing more than the wallpaper, visible, familiar, yet utterly ignored. Growing up in my family wasn't dramatic or tragic. It was far more subtle and far more dangerous than that. It was death by 1,000 small dismissals, each one tiny enough to be brushed off, but sharp enough to leave a scar, until eventually, you start to believe that maybe the version of you they see is all there is. I learned young that being quiet meant being overlooked, but being exceptional meant being resented, so I stopped trying to shine in ways they didn't understand. Luke always had the spotlight, and he wore it like it was made for him, even when he did nothing to earn it. First, the soccer trophies he barely contributed to, then the community college degree our parents celebrated like it was a PhD, and finally, the string of uninspired office jobs that were endlessly praised for their stability and responsibility, even as he coasted through them with a confidence he hadn't earned. Meanwhile, I got straight A's, interned for free at top firms, launched my first website at 19, and the most I ever got was a distracted, "good for you, honey," before the conversation swung back to whatever Luke had done that week. They weren't cruel people, not in the way you see in movies. They didn't scream or hit or say things they couldn't take back. They just didn't see me. Or rather, they saw the version of me they were comfortable with, the dreamer, the artsy one, the one who never quite followed through. They liked that version because it made Luke look better by comparison, and maybe it helped them feel like they'd done their job with at least one of us. So I learned to stop sharing. I learned that every accomplishment I brought to the table was either ignored, misunderstood, or, worst of all, met with that patronizing tone I came to despise. Well, maybe one day you'll figure it out. So I let them believe I hadn't. What they never knew is that somewhere between being ignored and underestimated, I built something no one could take away from me. It started as a side project, just a blog at first, anonymous, quiet, something that gave me joy when nothing else did. I wrote articles under a pseudonym, built a following, learned SEO and content strategy from scratch, taught myself analytics and monetization, while Luke was still struggling to find the print button on his office computer. Within 2 years, the blog became a brand, and that brand became a business, one with a product line, partnerships, and enough revenue to hire a small team. I reinvested everything, lived cheaply, and didn't tell a soul, not because I was hiding it, but because I had finally learned the power of doing things for myself, and not for the approval of people who had never been willing to offer it. By the time I was 29, I had 2 registered companies, one American and one overseas, both under layers of LLCs, with my name nowhere to be found unless you knew exactly where to look. I wasn't famous. I wasn't flashy. But I was free. I didn't owe anyone explanations, least of all the people who had never once asked what I actually wanted to do with my life beyond their tired suggestions about marketing or teaching. I didn't buy a house, didn't lease a luxury car, didn't post any of it online. I worked from coffee shops, libraries, hotel lobbies, always traveling, always quiet, always smiling politely when people asked if I was still trying to find myself. But even freedom has its costs, and mine came in the form of distance, emotional, physical, psychological. The more successful I became, the more I withdrew, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. Because the truth was, I didn't trust them to celebrate it. I didn't even trust them to understand it. I knew exactly what would happen if I told them. They'd be impressed for 15 seconds, then skeptical, then dismissive. Or worse, they'd take credit for it. We always knew she had it in her, they'd say, conveniently forgetting every passive-aggressive comment, every missed graduation, every time they called Luke the successful one right in front of me. So I stayed quiet. I built in silence. And eventually, I didn't even feel the need to share. Success stopped being something I wanted to show people and started being something I carried inside me like armor, light, silent, invisible. Until I found myself looking for ways to make it more than just mine. That's when I started investing. Not in stocks or startups, but in things that mattered, things that would never have my name on them, but would carry my fingerprints in quieter ways. Nonprofits. Scholarships. Affordable housing programs. At first, I gave anonymously, but over time I realized I wanted to be closer to the impact. So I bought property, not as a landlord, but as a benefactor. One of those properties, coincidentally, happened to be the same suburban ranch my parents had helped Luke buy last year. They still didn't know. As far as they were concerned, Luke had found a great deal, thanks to a friend of a friend, and they were just helping with the down payment. They didn't know the deal had been curated, the price adjusted, the loan quietly guaranteed by me. They didn't know the LLC that owned the house had my signature at the bottom of every legal document. They didn't know that Luke's job, his new fancy position managing a division of some logistics firm, was in a company I had invested in years ago, back when it was a struggling warehouse software startup I took a gamble on because I believed in the founder, not the product. They didn't know that their golden boy was climbing a ladder I had built from scratch. And maybe that makes me petty. Maybe some part of me wanted the irony. Maybe I enjoyed the quiet power of knowing that every brag, every toast to Luke's success, was unknowingly also a toast to me. But if I'm being honest, it wasn't about that anymore. It had stopped being about revenge a long time ago. Now it was about something else, something deeper. A question I didn't have an answer to. If your family never sees who you really are, does it matter that you became someone they never imagined? That night at dinner, when I saw the way Mom looked at me after I spoke, confused, almost offended, it hit me that I could never go back to being who they thought I was. And maybe I didn't want to. Maybe the version of me they remembered had to die so I could finally live. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Because the house they were all so proud of, the house they thought Luke had earned, was about to get a letter in the mail. Nothing aggressive. Nothing loud. Just an envelope. A single piece of paper. My name on it. And with that, the curtain would finally start to fall. There is a peculiar kind of unraveling that doesn't announce itself with drama or confrontation, no slamming doors or broken plates, no raised voices or tearful speeches, just a slow, quiet shift in energy. A flicker of recognition that something doesn't add up, that the math they've always believed in might be flawed, and for people like my brother Luke, whose entire identity had been built brick by brick from the foundation of being the favorite, the golden boy. The one who did everything. Right, that kind of realization is not just unsettling, it's dangerous. Not to me, of course. To him. Because once you take away the pedestal, the illusion starts to collapse under its own weight, and the person left standing there often doesn't know what to do without the applause. After that dinner, Luke didn't sleep well. I could tell by the way his eyes looked the next morning when I passed him in the hallway, red-rimmed, tight-lipped, the kind of face someone wears when they're not quite sure if they've been insulted or simply outmaneuvered. He tried to play it cool, of course, cracking some half-hearted joke about mystery money and secret empires, but there was a tremor in his voice, the kind that betrays something deeper, something harder to admit. For the first time in his life, he realized I wasn't playing the same game as him because I'd already won, and he hadn't even noticed I was on the board. The truth about Luke, and I say this without malice, but with years of observation behind it, is that he was never actually extraordinary. He was just never questioned. He was praised for average work, rewarded for predictable choices, and shielded from consequences by a network of soft expectations and familial indulgence. He didn't have to push himself because no one ever pushed him. And when he did fail, and he did, more times than they ever admitted, it was quietly erased, replaced by some new narrative about how hard he was trying, how things just didn't work out this time, how next quarter will be better. When he landed his latest position, the one they'd toasted to at dinner, It was through a connection, that word they loved to throw around, as if it was a badge of resourcefulness rather than a euphemism for unearned access. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have known, is that the company Luke now proudly represented was partially owned by a private fund I controlled, and that his division had been underperforming for nearly a year. Bleeding money and relying on a short extension I had personally approved because I wanted to see how long it would take before the truth surfaced. He wasn't managing a growing team, he was managing a dying branch, one that had been propped up more for appearances than results. And now, suddenly, that invisible support system was starting to wobble. Part of me expected him to lash out, to call me dramatic or selfish or accuse me of making things up for attention, because that's how he used to operate, especially when we were younger and he needed to reestablish control. But he didn't. Instead, he started probing, asking questions he'd never bothered with before. Casual, but pointed. Where had I been living lately? What kind of work did I do, really? Who were my clients? How did I meet them? Did I know anything about real estate law? At first, I answered vaguely, amused by the sudden curiosity, but then I realized something: he wasn't trying to understand me. He was trying to gauge how much of his world I had touched without his knowledge. The moment it clicked for him came in the form of a manila envelope that arrived at my parents' house 2 days after that dinner. It wasn't dramatic or marked urgent, just an ordinary piece of mail, but it carried within it something far more powerful than any speech I could have delivered: a property update, notifying the listed occupants of a transfer confirmation from the holding company to a local nonprofit. No explanation, no apology, just the cold, hard facts: ownership had changed. The house he thought he was paying off, the house Mom and Dad helped him secure, now belonged to someone else, and the name on the legal trail pointed straight back to me. The call came in that night. I didn't answer. Then came the texts, first from Luke, then from Mom, then a brief, tense one from Dad. Is this some kind of joke? We don't understand what's happening. We need to talk. But I stayed silent, not because I didn't want to explain, but because explanations only matter when the listener is willing to see you as you are, not as they've always decided you should be. Instead, I watched. I watched as Luke spiraled just enough to let the cracks show. He stormed into his office the next day and pulled up the internal records of the company, something he had probably never done with any real scrutiny until then, and that's where he found it. The investors list, the subsidiary trails, the majority vote clause. And then, finally, buried in the legal stack, a name he didn't recognize at first. A name that had meant nothing to him for years. My name. The same one he used to tease on the school bus. The one he once called pointless during a Thanksgiving toast because it sounded too artsy for anyone serious. I imagined that moment, sitting alone in his glass office, scrolling through contracts and realizing he had never really understood the game he was playing, much less the people around him. I don't know if he cried or laughed or just sat there staring at the screen in stunned silence. But I do know this: for the first time in our lives, Luke understood what it felt like to be small. To be in a room where the rules had shifted and he hadn't been invited to the table where they were written. He tried calling again the next day. I still didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't be met with defensiveness or denial or some weak attempt at reconciliation built entirely on the hope that I'd let things slide like I always used to. But I was done sliding. I had moved beyond explanation, beyond validation, beyond the need to be understood by people who had never shown the slightest interest in knowing me beyond the convenient versions they preferred. And yet, despite all this, I didn't hate him. I didn't hate any of them. That's the part that surprised me most. I felt detached. Like I had finally stepped out of a play I never auditioned for, and now I was watching it from the back of the theater, marveling at how predictable the plot had always been. But I wasn't finished. There was one more scene to set. The next morning, I opened my laptop, logged into my portfolio manager, and clicked a few buttons that would shift the final piece into place. Not out of spite, but out of resolution. Because closure doesn't always come with apologies or redemption arcs or teary reunions. Sometimes it comes in the form of a decision so quiet, so absolute, that it leaves no room for misinterpretation. I smiled as the confirmation page loaded, my name bold at the bottom of the screen. And I knew exactly what they'd find next. The silence that descended upon my family after the letter arrived wasn't the kind that stirs panic or incites confrontation. It was the thick, suffocating quiet that seeps into rooms long after trust has eroded. The kind that doesn't demand explanations, but instead forces people to sit with the weight of what they didn't see coming, or perhaps what they chose not to see. The envelope was unassuming, just a plain, cream-colored document tucked inside a legal-size folder, no dramatic markings or bold text, no threats or demands, only facts laid bare in language as dry as it was undeniable. A formal notice of ownership transfer, with every line leading to a single conclusion that none of them had been prepared to face. The house, the one Luke had been boasting about since the day he secured the deal, was no longer under the protective illusion of his success. It was mine, had always been mine, and now it belonged to someone else entirely, gifted away not out of spite, but out of a quiet, calculated resolve that needed no words to defend it. Mom called first, of course, her voice trembling not with fear or anger, but with confusion, the kind of maternal disbelief that rises when the narrative she's spent decades crafting begins to fray at the edges. She left a message that started with concern, dipped into disbelief, and then quickly curved into something else, something colder, edged with entitlement, and the subtle implication that I had broken a rule we'd all silently agreed upon. That I was to remain in the background, grateful for crumbs, and never, under any circumstances, dare to wield the kind of power they didn't think I was capable of holding. "I don't understand," she said, her voice thin. "Why would you do this? Why would you give away your brother's home?" As if Luke's entitlement was still somehow the priority, as if his claim to success hadn't been quietly subsidized by my silence all along. But what she didn't realize, what none of them had bothered to ask, was that I had never done any of it to hurt them. I had simply stopped pretending. Stopped playing the role of the grateful outsider. Stopped holding my breath every time someone at that table told me I'd find my path eventually, while ignoring the fact that I'd paved a dozen roads in the dark without asking for a single map. The truth was, the house had never really belonged to Luke, not in any meaningful sense. It was a symbol, a carefully constructed facade meant to reinforce a myth that was easier for everyone to believe, that he was the achiever, the foundation. The proof that the family had done something right. Taking it away didn't break the myth, it revealed how flimsy it had been all along. When Dad finally called, he didn't yell, didn't scold, didn't even ask for details. His message was only 5 words long. "You didn't need to do that." And for a brief moment, I wondered if there was something close to recognition in his tone, if some small part of him had always known I was building something outside their line of sight, if maybe he'd suspected, but chose the comfort of tradition over the discomfort of reassessing who his daughter had become. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I understood something they never could. Some truths lose their power when spoken aloud. What mattered now wasn't that they knew the details of my success, or that they suddenly saw me in a new light. What mattered was that they realized, irrevocably, that I had never needed their approval to begin with. Luke's response, when it finally came, was predictably performative, a string of indignant texts followed by a long, rambling email filled with wounded ego and self-pity masked as outrage. He accused me of being vindictive, of orchestrating some elaborate revenge fantasy, of trying to make a point in a way that hurts everyone, never once acknowledging the years he spent absorbing praise that was never earned. The way he'd casually dismissed my choices as cute or idealistic, the way he'd soaked up attention like a sponge while I worked in silence, building something real. In the end, his words only proved what I already knew, that he hadn't seen me before, and he still didn't see me now, only the threat I represented to the fragile reality he'd mistaken for stability. But what they didn't know, what no one had even thought to imagine, is that this wasn't the climax of some revenge arc, wasn't the culmination of a long-harbored grudge, but merely the beginning of something far more permanent. I had decided, long before that dinner, that I wasn't going to measure my worth in comparison to theirs anymore. I had spent years trying to be seen, to be understood, to be acknowledged not just for what I'd accomplished, but for who I'd become in the process. But somewhere along the line, I realized that recognition from people unwilling to evolve was a hollow prize, and I was done begging for breadcrumbs at a table I could have rebuilt from scratch. That's why I gave the house away, not to take something from Luke, but to give something to people who might actually use it as a beginning, not a trophy. I chose a women's shelter because I knew what it felt like to live under someone else's roof and never feel like you belonged, to be told that your presence was conditional, your value negotiable, your potential always almost enough. I wanted that space to mean something more than family pretense and empty toasts. I wanted it to shelter someone who'd been told they were too much, too little, or simply in the way. I signed the final transfer online, in silence, no witnesses, no dramatic music, just a quiet click, a digital acknowledgement that something had ended, not with fire or fury, but with clarity. The moment the confirmation appeared, I sat back, folded my hands in my lap, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: weightlessness. Not joy, not satisfaction, but the absence of weight, the release of a burden I'd carried for too long without ever realizing just how heavy it had become. They would talk, I knew that. There would be whispers among extended family, long conversations filled with confusion, maybe even speculation about my mental state, my motivations, my change in behavior. Let them talk. Let them dig for reasons that made them comfortable, theories that fit within the narrow lanes they'd carved for me over the years. I wouldn't be there to correct them. I wouldn't be there to smile politely or defend choices that never needed defending. I was done performing. Done playing nice. Done pretending that peace meant silence and that love required self-erasure. The only message I sent was a single line, in a group thread I hadn't used in over a year: consider this my gift to the next version of us, if there ever is one. I didn't wait for replies. I didn't check to see if it was read. Because some messages aren't meant to start a conversation. They're meant to end one. In the days that followed the unveiling, after the dust had settled, but before the emotional rubble had truly begun to register, I found myself existing in that strange, suspended state where clarity sharpens, but emotions remain elusive. Where everything you've waited years to say has already been spoken, not with words exactly, but through action, and yet you find yourself asking, was that enough? The house was no longer theirs, or mine, or Luke's, or anyone's to parade around as proof of success. It had become something better, an anonymous offering to women I'd never meet, but who, perhaps unlike me, would finally feel safe within its walls. But even after the deed was done, after the legal transfer was confirmed, after the string of unanswered messages had faded into silence, I couldn't quite put to rest the question that had haunted me, not through my rise, but through my quiet distance from the people I had once so desperately hoped would understand me. What do you owe to those who never saw you clearly, even after you've stopped needing their gaze? I hadn't planned to return to the neighborhood, let alone to the house itself. I'd told myself that cutting the final thread required no ceremony, that closure was an internal thing, a quiet shift of the soul, not a pilgrimage to old places with new meanings. But something gnawed at me, not regret, not hesitation, but perhaps the simple, human instinct to bear witness to change, to look at the space that had once represented everything I'd tried to earn and finally see it for what it was, a shell. So one morning, I parked across the street under the shade of an old elm tree whose branches I remembered climbing as a child, its bark still scarred from initials I'd carved with a plastic knife when no one was watching. The house itself looked the same, almost disappointingly so: beige siding, green shutters, the porch swing still creaking faintly in the wind. There were no moving vans yet, no visible transformation, just the faint hum of a world still catching up to a decision already made. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't knock on the door. I just sat there, engine off, watching the place that had once held so many Sunday dinners, so many awkward conversations, so many moments when I had smiled through clenched teeth and told myself that patience was a virtue. I had no desire to go back inside, to retrace the footsteps of someone I no longer was, but I did have one final gesture left in me, not for them, not really, but for myself. I opened the glove compartment and took out a small envelope I'd written the night before, the handwriting deliberate, the words simple. I crossed the street slowly, the way you move through a dream where everything is familiar but distant, and tucked the note into the screen door, weighing it down with a stone I found in the yard, one of those flat, chalky ones we used to stack in the garden. Then I turned back without looking through the window, without glancing at the mailbox, without waiting for anyone to come out. The note didn't contain explanations or apologies or even accusations. It simply read, "I don't hate you. I just finally chose myself." It was not an invitation to reconnect. It was not a challenge. It was a full stop at the end of a sentence I'd been writing since I was 12. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my own life, which by now was fuller than it had ever been, not with noise or attention, but with intention. I had started funding a program that offered microgrants and mentorship to women launching their own small businesses, especially those who had no family support or formal networks. The kind of women who might have been overlooked or underestimated because they didn't fit into someone's neat little version of success. I didn't put my name on anything. I didn't tweet about it. I didn't even tell my closest friends. I just kept building quietly, deliberately, the way I always had. And yet, the past has a way of reaching out not to reclaim you, but to test your resolve. One night, weeks after I thought everything was behind me, I saw Luke's name flash on my phone again, this time not calling, just a voicemail. For reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't delete it right away. I didn't open it either. I just let it sit there, like a ghost sealed in a bottle, not out of fear of what he might say, but because I finally understood that I didn't need to hear it to know the ending. Whatever he said, whether it was anger, confusion, apology, or silence, it wouldn't change the truth that I had spent years shaping myself into someone worthy, only to realize that I'd been worthy all along, and that their inability to see it had never been mine to fix. That night, I stood on the balcony of my apartment overlooking a city that felt more like home than any childhood room ever had, and I played the message, not aloud, not through the speakers, just silently in my mind, scripting it the way I knew it would go. I imagined his voice, hesitating, maybe softened by the months gone by. I imagined him saying he was sorry, that he didn't understand, that things had changed. I imagined him not saying anything at all, just breathing on the line, the way people do when they call not to speak, but simply to ask, without words, whether the door is still open. But I didn't respond. Not because I hadn't forgiven him, or my parents, or the years I spent trying to prove something they'd never asked to see. I had. But forgiveness, I had learned, didn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes, it came with a quiet choice to let the story end where it needs to, not where others hope it might resume. Sometimes, it came with walking away, not in anger, but in peace. And peace, as it turns out, isn't loud. It's the absence of need. It's the freedom of not explaining. It's the power of leaving the last thing you said as the last thing you needed to say.